opportunity to hear this Dr. Russel Jaffe, President and I guess owner of Serum Laboratories in Virginia, Reston, Virginia. Russell has impressed me and a lot of other people with the scope of his knowledge in a whole lot of fields that he brings to immunology. And I would like Russell to fill in the things in his CV that he'd like people to know. Give you a little bit about yourself so we get to know you better. And then he's going to talk to us today about just what we've been talking about this morning, immunotoxicology.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you. Any of you who had any doubt about why I'm known as the late Dr. Jaffe have probably figured out this morning why that is, and I want to thank Vera very much for swapping times of the presentations. I have a heartening brief story to explain part of why I was late. After leaving Kennedy Airport last night, I had stayed, and I apologize for missing the meeting. It was a wonderful program. I had introduced a fellow named Paul Brodeur, who had important new information about electromagnetic fields and how they can help and harm. And then there had been an after strategy session for some of the next action steps. So I was at Kennedy Airport, going to fly here yesterday. Microphone.
The one on the stand.
Use this one. Okay, there we go. Aha. Make it easier and not shout so much. I was at Kennedy Airport with my passport and all the documents, and by the time I got to Mexico City, I had no passport. So it really challenged my meditative, quiet skill. And I had decided that I was going to lead a life in which I walk my talk, and I have Paramahansa Yogananda's metaphysical meditations, and I opened them up, and it says, I will make my inner environment perfect through meditation, that it be impervious to all adverse outside influences. Well, I had a very adverse outside influence called I didn't have a passport and I wasn't sure I could get through customs. But I figured that sweat on my upper lip wasn't going to help. So I went to the young lady at customs and I said, I'm terribly sorry, I'm so absent-minded, I have forgotten my entry document. Would you give me a new entry document? Which she did. She didn't ask to see my passport. She may not have asked to see yours. Apparently with the red-green system, they may not have known that. But they may have. And I was embarrassed to find that I didn't have my passport. As I got on the plane this morning, a young lady hands me an envelope with my passport in it. And I asked her, how did you get this back to me? She said, oh, they made a note in your record that you didn't scream and yell when you reported that your passport was missing. I said, well, screaming and yelling wouldn't have helped the person receiving the report, and it wouldn't have helped me to scream and yell. My thyroid and adrenals and immune system would have all been bollocksed up. And she said, how do you say bollocksed up in Spanish? I said, no. They somehow linked the fact that I had remained calm in the midst of what for me was a very unsettling circumstance. I knew I could get to Vallarta. The question was, could I ever get back to my family? But I tried to practice what I preached, and I did what I could, and eventually this woman quite spontaneously returned my documents, also my day book with all of my little notes to myself, you know, all those to-do list things that didn't quite get done that are still on the to-do list. I lost my to-do list. I was like Linus without his blanket. I think that Vera's talk was really a perfect way of setting in perspective what we have learned, and I would like to take the next hour or so to develop upon, build upon, reinforce, and agree with the message that you heard. We have come through different methodology, yes, cell response methodology, but a different way of doing lymphocyte functional response methodology, now Medicare approved, reimbursable, and isolatable. In other words, we can provide you with lymphocyte response assays to the minerals, or we can provide you lymphocyte response assays to environmental volatile organic chemicals, or foods, preservatives, and so forth and so on. We think in many chronic ills, chronic autoimmune conditions, that it's desirable to have as comprehensive a fingerprint of the human immune system as possible, and we'll talk about what that information provides and why. But I'd like to start with this Oriental saying, which I take it you've looked at, and an architecture that I think can bring all of this seminar into perspective. And it begins, our story begins with a lymphocyte. A particular lymphocyte, not any lymphocyte, a CD3 lymphocyte. What is a CD3 lymphocyte? A CD3 lymphocyte is a small precursor lymphocyte. Remember the previous presentation, those were those small sleeping lymphocytes that were tolerant to what was going on, but they could respond? Okay. The CD3 is the precursor lymphocyte. There are three possible responses when we add a foreign antigen. If we add a foreign antigen, and let's say that foreign antigen happens to be a particular mercury salt, and yes, this would be by the haptene mechanisms, or it could be some other adjuvant like silicone, and we test both for silica and for polymers of the silicone dioxide, or the multimers of silicone dioxide that went into the silicone breast implants. Or it might be a more conventional antigen such as beta lactoglobulin or gluten from wheat, or some other digestively derived antigen. When some foreign antigen gets to a lymphocyte, reaction will take place. Now that reaction may be good or bad for the person. If you are in a state of higher level health, when the foreign antigen comes in, what happens? You become tolerant. And your tolerance can express itself in one of two ways. Either by developing a plasma cell, or by developing a null lymphocyte. Now, a null lymphocyte means that the smart guys at the places that they give numerical names to lymphocytes haven't figured out what numerical name to give to the lymphocyte, but we now are up to over 100 different subtypes of lymphocytes. Over 100 different subtypes of lymphocytes to understand the helpers, the counter-helpers, the counter-counter-helpers, the counter-counter-counter-helpers, the suppressors, the counter-suppressors, the counter-counter-counter-counter-suppressors. I was at a National Academy of Sciences meeting not too long ago, and they asked Stu Schlossman to describe the last decade of immunology and our exploding understanding of cytokines and interleukins and lymphocyte subsets and so forth, and he said, "Oy vey, it's worse than coagulation." Now, I take that personally because I was a coagulationist. If any of you know about the test for platelet aggregation that gives dose-response data for epinephrine, arachidonic acid, thrombin, collagen, ADP, and so forth, that was an assay that Dan Dakin and I developed. If you know about the aspirin tolerance test in coagulation, that was a procedure that Harry Milkey and Dan Dakin and I developed when I was in Boston. And I started out as a coagulationist, and yes, platelets are very finicky little beasties to work with, and so are lymphocytes. But we can get specimens that allow us to have a low background reactivity, and with the benefit of high amplification assays like enzyme-linked assays, we can, on a much smaller sample, rather than 1 million cells, we can do a lymphocyte response assay on 35,000 cells because of the kinase enzyme that is the specific one that we're measuring that only gets turned on when the antigen recognition happens. So when there's an antigen recognition, the precursor lymphocyte CD3 says, I'm going to turn on, and if you're in a healthy state, you turn on towards tolerance and you make antibodies. And you make antibodies of various kinds depending on exactly where and how this happened. It might be IgA, it might be IgG, it might be IgM, it might be IgE, it might be IgD. Or the null lymphocytes make various kinds of cytokines, which are communication molecules that go and tell the pain system of the body, the repair system of the body, the activation system of the body, what to do, what its set point is, how the weather is, and how the kids are. Now, the alternative is to either go in the direction of upregulation, either go in the direction of maximostimulation, and then you would turn on the production of what kind of lymphocyte? Maximostimulation would give you not the helpers, the suppressors. Because when you stimulate the system, the body adapts and responds by proliferating the suppressor cells. So you get CD8 production when you maximo stimulate or upregulate the system. I'm now suggesting that there is synergy amongst the antigens, including mercury and silicone and others, that all synergies are not alike, that there are adjuvant synergies. Silicone is an adjuvant more often than not. It upregulates the whole system non-specifically. Mercury and other minerals are generally haptenes. They are also poisons, enzyme poisons and metabolic uncoupler poisons, and they do lots of difficult bad things. But they are also haptenic foreign invader antigens and part of the total foreign antigen load. And what we seek to do is identify the patient-specific total foreign antigen load, lower that, identify specific deficiencies in nutrients, antioxidants, buffering minerals, and the like, correct those. Where necessary, look at other functional tests like salivary tests for the adrenal stress index, provocative urine mineral tests for nutritional and toxic mineral quantitative status. Although there are things that we should talk about at the question and answer time, it's not as simple anymore as doing a provocative test to know what the tissue burden is, because you have long half-life tissues like the aorta, like the cartilage, like the bone. So it may be 6 months after starting a preventive or health promotive program that the bulk of the burden of the toxic minerals that was buried during childhood or during adolescence comes out in the 50s. Right? I see some people nodding in the audience that this is something we have observed clinically, and we can now, by serial testing, say every 3 months, do a D-penicillamine, or if you prefer DMSA, or if you prefer DMPS, whatever oral chelator will get across the blood-brain barrier, will get into the tissues, and give you a meaningful sweep of the tissues. And we have a protocol, as some of you know, that's D-penicillamine based, but you can substitute any other chelator of choice for that. But it looks at the tissue levels by looking at the second day urine. The second day urine, not the first day urine. The first day of a chelator, you clear the plasma. No scientist is going to believe that you're looking at the tissues on the first day. By the second day, you basically washed out the plasma. Now you're looking at the tissues, if but only if your chelator gets in the tissues. Well, the one chelator that everybody agrees gets everywhere is penicillamine. And by everywhere, I mean everywhere that there's diffusion. First, second, and third space, for those of you who are physiologists. Intracellular, extracellular, across the blood-brain barrier, wherever you want it to go. It is also the item most studied. We know most about its side effects and how to avoid them, and they're completely avoidable. And we know most about the patient individual responses, because whenever you give anything, even if it's a short pulse of a chelator, patients who are on the edge, and boy, you'd be surprised how your chronic fatigue or MS or fibromyalgia or other patients are on the edge. Patients who are on the edge may adversely react to a sulfhydryl scavenger that goes in and starts complexing with a bunch of things. And I favor the penicillamine because we've had more worldwide experience with it. It's not just for copper, it's for anything with 2 charges, any divalent cation. Question?
Yes, if you do penicillamine like 250 milligrams IV, you do the collection the second day?
Well, yes, if you do it IV, it's a little different protocol. I recommend the oral administration of 500 milligrams QID for 3 days. 500 milligrams of D-penicillamine, goes by the brand name cupramine. Don't let that fool you, it's for more than copper. And you give that QID for 3 days. And on the second day, collect a 24-hour urine and get both nutritional plus toxic minerals analyzed on that. And the method for mercury should be cold vapor or some other advanced method, because just warming up a specimen is enough for mercury to go away. There was a reason that people thought penicillamine was not such a good chelator because it wasn't stripping as much mercury out. But it turns out John Pangborn and I confirmed, and a group from the Max Planck Institute at Göttingen, I believe, published before we got it published, that mercury complexes so tightly with penicillamine to form the equivalent of a thiazolidine ring that that ring doesn't dissociate under the conditions in which you measure the mercury in the cold vapor machine. So you miss maybe a quarter to a half or more of the mercury that the penicillamine is pulling out because the machine doesn't measure it, but it's really there. And you can prove that it's there if you use sodium borohydride to reduce the penicillamine back to its reduced state and liberate the mercury. Pangborn and I have done that. You can see a white precipitin form if you add spiked amounts of mercury to a depenicillamine-containing urine. That's the complex with the mercury. I like that because it means when the mercury washes through the kidney, it is not likely to dissociate from the penicillamine. Now, if you're going to give it IV, I would still measure the second day, but I would now give 500 milligrams IV, not 250. Because 2,000 milligrams PO is equivalent to about 500 milligrams IV. The other point that I would make, though, is that while IV will give you a peak, there is a rapid die-away, whereas the oral administration is associated with a slow uptake, a flat peak, and a slow die-away. I actually, for the diagnostic test, I'm not talking therapeutically now, but diagnostically I prefer to use the penicillamine orally. Now, doctors have asked me, colleagues have asked me, what about on the second day, giving a spike of EDTA to really clear the plasma, what you've mobilized with the penicillamine? It's an interesting question. I don't have data. If anyone has data on that, I'd love to know whether you get more predictive data. What we're looking for, as Vera so elegantly pointed out, is data in which the laboratory functional test, the cell response, lymphocyte response test, correlates with the status of the patient and improving the metal toxic, immunotoxic situation improves the health of the patient. That's the goal, is outcome studies. And I will tell you about a fibromyalgia outcome study. We have had similar results as yours, Vera, with chronic fatigue. Both in how prevalent the metal, and I mean you have to test all the metals. Interestingly, we didn't know which mercury to use, so we just put 6 mercury salts in. And we use a little less in our assay because we have the enzyme amplification, so we go down to about a picomole is on each plate. So that's all that we have. Very small concentrations, because these cells, when the enzyme gets turned on, it really gets turned on. And you have a very high amplification of signal because there's a lot of this kinase enzyme. These cells are really cranking. This is days before you see thymidine incorporation, days before you see proliferation of colonies, but exactly the same kind of assay. And I think it is very important to note that 2 independent workers developing lymphocyte response assays, but very different lymphocyte response assays. Vera's more classical than mine. Ours dependent upon the colony formation data or the thymidine incorporation data, the tritiated thymidine uptake data that more classical lymphocyte assays have, and elegantly reduced to specific epitopes, to specific antigens. And I want to applaud and reinforce that message, that we need to look at many different epitopes. Notice that one person would react to thiomerisol, and another person would react to methylmercury, and another person would react to phenylmercury. Oh my gosh, doesn't it get complicated? But what I believe you need to know, and your patients need to know, is whether they are tolerant to the assaults of the 20th century, which is the goal. In the state of health, we still get assaulted. You can't not get assaulted. Just, go out. Maybe if you live in the woods on the top of a mountain, you get less assault, but even there, I've had it pointed out to me that Sherpas who schlep in the Himalayas, try saying that at 9 o'clock in the morning, that Sherpas who schlep in the Himalayas have high levels of lead, PCBs and PBBs, volatile organic chemicals, solvents, and chlordane. Now I promise you that the building codes in Kathmandu do not require chlordane on the foundation. This is chlordane being carried up into the stratosphere and deposited in the rain, in the ice, in the snow, in the Himalayas, and it comes down into the Hunza Valley, it comes down into the areas all over the world. And I've done briefings for Royal Dutch Shell. Can you imagine a fool's errand? I tried 10 years ago to get Royal Dutch Shell out of the pesticide business, 15 years ago. Time flies when you're having fun. I got up through the lower level folks who could understand the data. And then we reached the people who made decisions. Now, a very important change happened. Up until the point that I'm now going to describe, we had discussions among seemingly adult human beings, and there were generally a wide range of backgrounds and types of people in the room. The final meeting, men flew from The Hague and from London to Washington, D.C. We were going to do this briefing. I walk in the room, and there are 6 white European males all over the age of 70. They weren't going to understand what I had to say from now till next Easter. I turned to Napier Collins, who helped found the Global Business Network, if you know about Peter Schwartz and all of that. And Napier is the one who set me up to do this briefing. I said, Napier, I don't think I'm going to be able to bond with these people. He said, tell jokes. I tried some of my best lines. It wasn't the translation. They didn't think they were funny. I did finally get their attention. I pointed out that pesticides or biocides, as I prefer to refer to them, they are not pest specific, they are life-killing, that biocides are low-level estrogens. And if they wanted their grandsons to have children, that they should be concerned about the low-level estrogens in all of our food supply, in all of our fat tissues, in all of our dairy supply, in all of the world. And they said, can you prove that? Now, 10 years ago, all I could say to them was, the alligators in the Okefenokee swamp are sterile. The number of tree frogs has declined in the world by 80%. The number of turtles has declined in the world by 80%, and the white pines are dying. And they said, so what? Now remember, this was 1980. It was not a very enlightened time. So I told them a Native American story. Because you see, 1,500 years ago, did I stay up too late last night? What is that feedback? 1,500 years ago, the 7 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy were at war. And they had been at war for so long that the people were not prospering, and all their resources were going into non-renewable armaments. And the proportion of their gross domestic tribal income devoted to war was just outrageous, and they were sinking in debt. And the peacemaker came. The peacemaker came and slowly over time convinced them that they should give peace a chance. It's a good line. And eventually, it's a long story, they buried all the implements of war and the words of war under a great white pine. And for 1,000 years there was peace in the Iroquois Confederacy. And their prophecy was that after about 1,000 years, pale-skinned people were going to come in boats and they were going to make a big mess. That's a long story, but I shortened it. And I tell the story because after the land was rained upon by fire, which is called acid rain, then the poisons in the skin of the earth, that's called aluminum, lead, nickel, other poisons, would become mobilized, which it should not be. And this would poison the white pines. And do you know that have you been to the white pine forests in New England recently? Have you seen what they look like? They look somewhat like the Black Forest in Germany. Not a very pretty picture. The relevance of all of this is that at the time when it looks bleakest for the environment, when the low-level estrogens finally get the alligators and even get onto CNN and PBS, which they did recently, the alligators, that is, it will look very bleak, but a group of children will be born. And these children, if they don't get intoxicated by the very sick world in which they live, will be able to hold up the white pine so it doesn't fall. Because if the turtles do go away, if the tree frogs do go away, so will we. We are not separate from anything else. It wasn't Chief Joseph who came to that idea first, but it was well said, actually in 1971 by a screenwriter. I must tell you, Chief Joseph never made that great speech. But we are interconnected, and the toxins that we are talking about, whether we start the train in the mouth and look around to the other end of the alimentary tract, or whether we start the train in the garden and traffic to the table. What we find is that we are all doing, almost all of us, a few of us have opted out of this, but most of us are doing an experiment in the restructured environment. And that includes the restructured diet, the restructured water supply, the restructured family, the restructured air, the restructured school, and the restructured environment. And I hope that you signed your informed consent, because there are definite risks to taking the social structure apart and taking the nutrients out of the food and then fortifying the food, right? Has anyone tumbled to the fact that there are many oxymorons that are rampant today, one of which is called enriched or fortified food? Excuse me? Why do we need to fortify the food? Well, because there weren't any nutrients in it. Why weren't there any nutrients in it? Well, so that we could prepare a product that would stay in the silo for years. Aha! We want to design a food system around, for example, moving tomatoes 2,000 miles on average and having flour that even rats won't eat. Now, during World War II, when they only had wholemeal, they made wholemeal bread. And do you know that the nutrition of the people, and I don't mean the ones who had the bombs fall on them, but the other people who didn't, in spite of all that terrible stress, the nutritional competency of the United Kingdom went up and the chronic disease rates went down during World War II. And a large part of that was written up in a wonderful book by a Professor Albright called Secrets of the Soil, and more recently an updated book also titled Secrets of the Soil by Chris Bird and Peter Tompkins. You may remember them from Secret Life of Plants and Pyramids and so other unmentionable topics. But I was telling a story about lymphocytes, and I believe that these lymphocytes are the microcosm to respond, and that it is not just coincidence that we have so many people attacking themselves today. We have autoimmunity. We have autoimmunity at the personal level, cellular, organ, and individual. We have autoimmunity at the community level. We have autoimmunity at the national and international levels. And I don't know, but pretty soon we're going to be putting this stuff out in outer space. We're going to have intergalactic autoimmunity. And I do mean that to get a chuckle, because laughter improves your immune competency. And thinking about these subjects may not. And I do laugh a lot. Sometimes because I get the cosmic joke of it all, and sometimes because of the two, and I've tried both, I'll take laughter. I've tried the tears. There are times for tears. They can really be very healing in their way. But of the two, I'll take laughter. And is everyone familiar with the studies that show that your mucosal secretory IgA antibody response is improved by favorable circumstances, by seeing a movie that's positively imaged, improves your mucosal secretory IgA competency for 2 weeks? And conversely, reading a Stephen King novel for most people, or watching a movie of the Holocaust. And guess what? Jewish kids were more affected than other children. You know that we spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to find out that Jews identify with the Holocaust now. That was a piece of science we needed to do. But the more important point is that your secretory IgA would go down and stay down for 2 weeks after just watching a movie. Nobody came in a stormtrooper outfit and roughed you up. This is just a movie. That's how functionally dynamic we are. I often prescribe, along with the antioxidant nutrients, along with the dietary changes to make an alkaline diet that people can digest, And to restore digestive competency, recommend targeted doctor-certified supplementation. But in addition, in the healthy habits category, I often recommend an hour a day of laughter. And patients most often look back at me and say, yeah, sure. And I say, how much time each day do you spend laughing? And do you know that I would say the laughter index in this country right now is really down. I don't know whether it's because Sid Caesar retired or what happened, but it used to be that people could take a joke. I want you to know my wife says it took 10 years in our relationship before I started to take a joke. It was a major bone of contention, I must tell you. For years, I told her she was laughing at me. And she said, I'm not laughing at you, dear. You're just very funny. And I said, not now. No. Her family has the wonderful ability to chuckle, to laugh, to engage life as if it were part sport and part contact, or as if it was a contact sport. To be completely involved and absolutely non-attached. That's where the beginnings of real tolerance come from. Now, what if instead of hyperstimulation, we had, either because of exhaustion or for some other reason, a significant downregulation? A downregulation of immune responses, then we would get what? The helper CD4 cell. But now, to make things more complicated, there are at least Th1 and Th2 types of CD4 cells, and this won't be a big shock to you, but the CD8s are now being divided also into type 1 and type 2 CD8 cells. And I can even take this simple derivation and put all autoimmunity on it. How's that for a challenge? We're now going to take the same nomenclature, but a fresh page, and put all of autoimmunity on this diagram. So we start with our friend, the CD3 cell, and we go either in the direction of CD8s or in the direction of CD4s, which can either be type 1 or type 2. I'm dyslexic, so I put them in the wrong order. Now, and as I mentioned, if we were in a tolerant state, then we would either be making the null cells or the plasma cells. And now let's look at the kinds of pathology that would happen if you actually had the kind of downregulation that links to overproduction of CD4 cells. The diseases that you would get are what I would call autoimmunity type 1. And by autoimmunity type 1, I'm including, this is for the Th1 cells. Autoimmunity type 1 is adult diabetes mellitus, cardiovascular disease and stroke, hypoglycemia. Now, hypoglycemia actually gets into energy regulation, which is overlaid on this. Now, what about the type 2 reactions? These I would broadly call autoimmunity type 2, and autoimmunity type 2 are the connective tissue disorders. So this is everything from lupus to arthritis, from Wegener's granulomatosis to mixed connective tissue disease, from SLE to glomerulonephritis. Well, let's go the other side. What about the condition where everything is turned on, 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 and not turned off? What do we get out of that? We get autoimmunity type 3, and autoimmunity type 3 is AIDS and fertility problems. Now, for the moment, since I don't want to distract this conversation, and I hope that Vera will interrupt me, and I apologize for those interjections before. AIDS and fertility go together. They at least both have to do with the reproductive system, kind of. And I'll link it in questions and answers if you wish later. But let me suggest that we are about to see an epidemic of low fertility. And the World Population Council may be the last to learn this, but they can declare victory. Because the sperm count of the average young college-age male from 1880 to 1950 was roughly stable at about 100 million. And maybe it had begun to decline a little before that. But since 1950, the numbers are 80 million, 60 million, 50 million, 40 million, 30 million, bringing us up to the current. In the 1960s, when I was a medical student and a young budding clinical pathologist in the early 70s, 30 million sperm was marginal for fertility. It's now average for young, you know, those college-age males who have hormone raging. They already have low sperm counts. Why do they have low sperm counts? Well, the energy in their cell division mechanism has been zapped or trapped or short-circuited because of the accumulation of the toxic minerals and the overall accumulation of immunotoxic load totally in the presence of nutritional deprivations and high distress. Distress means cortisol steal, cholesterol goes being drawn to cortisol because of adrenal hyperstimulation and not going to DHEA and therefore testosterone, estrogen, and other anabolic hormones. All this just by living in the 20th century. Now, I think it's quite exciting that we can begin to link across so many chronic disease categories, a common linkage of disequilibrium in the immune system. And the goal that we share in common is to return homeostasis. And homeostasis is the condition in which things go in the direction of production of plasma cells and null cells. These are the cells produced in a homeostatically competent individual. So what we seek to do clinically is to identify the antigens that cause the disorder, identify the antigens and substitute for them. The dietary antigens, the mineral antigens, whatever the antigens happen to be, identify them by a functionally predictive assay, and then use that information to modify lifestyle and diet for just 3 months. If you ask people to do this for a lifetime, forget it. But if you say to someone, could you imagine doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for 3 months if I could guarantee you A, B, C, D, E as the outcome results? And people will say, sure, I can imagine that, doc. Can you guarantee me? No, sir, no, ma'am. I can't guarantee you that the sun's going to rise in the morning. But I can tell you that for the condition in which your immune system is in disarray as it is for many different reasons, this comprehensive approach is what I would recommend, and let's go by results. Never promise. Let the results speak for themselves. You will not only get patients who bring their families, they will bring busloads of their friends, because do you know how many Americans now qualify for the diagnosis of chronic fatigue? And it matters whether it's CFIDS or CFS or how you define it, but do you know it's up in the millions? Somewhere between 4 and 30 million people are dragging around. Do you know how many people have fibromyalgia? 22 to 28 million Americans. 5 to 9% of all the visits to family practice doctors in 1991 were for fibromyalgia. 15 to 20% of the visits to rheumatologists in 91 were for fibromyalgia. And do we have a clue what to do for fibromyalgia? No. The only thing we know is that all the anti-pain remedies fail, and that the only thing that shows current mainstream promise is trank the patient to the point where they don't care. So you give the patient a histamine blocking phenothiazine type tranquilizer and you say, how do you feel? And they say, no different, but I don't care. Now that is a Freudian success. Freud really did say that he thought after many years in psychiatry that the most we could hope for was to move people from being neurotically unhappy to being merely unhappy. Sorry, I'd like to raise the horizon just a little. So what we are talking about then is an approach that clinically becomes straightforward but distinctive because it looks at the causes rather than the consequences of chronic ill health. And by the causes, I mean the mechanisms. And I agree with Vera again on this, that having a mechanism that we can point to that links lymphocyte-specific subset responses to the development of these specific autoimmune diseases, and we can get even further into it by pointing out if you don't have antioxidants and you have an antigen load because of digestive incompetency and hyperpermeability of your gut, and you add to that aspirin or NSAIDs or steroids or medications that suppress the cyclooxygenase system necessary for cell proliferation and repair, if you inhibit repair in a person who is chronically repair deficient, you will get a further diseased person, a person whose repair deficit has gone from bad to much worse. There must be a better way. The better way is to begin, as we're doing, to look together at the underlying mechanisms, look at the causes, not at the consequences. And now what do you want to know? You want to know what is the status of the patient with regard to nutritional competency, with regard to attitudinal competency, because it does matter what the patient thinks or what the patient believes. For example, Dr. Bernie Lown, for many years, told this story about a patient of his who had had an anterior septal myocardial infarction. 70% of his muscle was damaged, and Bernie walked in one day, listened to the heart, and said, "Boy, this patient has a healthy gallop." Now, those of you who know enough to know that's a bad prognostic sign, but the patient thought, the great Dr. Lown thought his gallop was healthy, so his heart must be okay, and he recovered. Another story, Dr. Shelley Kopp, a famous psychiatrist, had a cardiologist whose name was Halberstam, not the author, his brother, of blessed memory. And Shelley was in the hospital with his 5th myocardial infarction, and on the first day in the CCU, Halberstam walks in. Dr. Halberstam says, "Shelley, you're the patient, not the doctor. You've got to lay down." And Shelley says, "I am resting. I'm working on the manuscript of my book." And the doctor said, "Lay down, put the bed down, give me the manuscript." Shelley gave him the manuscript. The doctor turned to walk away, and the light went off, the bell went off, and the nurses started running towards him. He turned around, and Shelley Kopp was in ventricular fibrillation. His last words were, "Give me back the manuscript." Halberstam threw the manuscript on the bed. They didn't even have to defibrillate him. He went into normal sinus rhythm, didn't have another ectopic beat for the entire time he was in the hospital. So attitude and understanding are parts of this whole equation. We also must look at the environment. I had a patient once, and I told him that I wanted him to walk 2 miles every evening. And he came back 20 days later, and I said, "How are things at home?" He said, "How would I know? I'm 40 miles from home." It's an old joke, but it works. We also have to look at the toxins. We have to look at the immunotoxins. And we have to look at the distress. Now, the distress is really related to the attitudes, but it's so important, and we give it such lip service that I'll actually put it up twice. And when we look at nutritional competency, what do we find? Not much. If you use the old tests, for example, the classic is magnesium, and most, at least cardiologists, if not family practice doctors, will understand this one. 80% of the patients in the coronary care unit lack magnesium in their myocardium. What percentage of them have a magnesium in their serum that is out of the usual range? 20%. So 60% of the patients who are deficient in their myocardial cells are not out of the usual range on a lab test, which, not surprisingly, is designed to go out of range only when more than 80% of function is lost. Well, maybe you need more than 20% of myocardial magnesium. What a surprise. Maybe being 60% down in magnesium, which isn't yet out of range, is still an increased risk factor for cardiac irritability. Maybe if you're eating an acid diet. Does everybody know what an acid-forming diet is? The standard American diet? The SAD diet? And it is a SAD diet. If you want to put people on a therapeutic diet, don't Mickey Mouse around. 80% alkaline-forming foods, and that is boring. But it can be interesting. And here's how you make it interesting. It's fruits and vegetables, it's lentils, but it's also seasonings, herbs, spices, nuts, seeds, sprouts. They're very interesting things. I have recommended to patients that they try sprouting. And they asked whether that was a skin condition that I was recommending they have. They didn't have a clue. Okay, this is where people are in America today. Ask children in America where milk comes from. You know where milk comes from? Supermarkets, not cows. And do you know why Mike Taylor from the Food and Drug Administration is now over at the Department of Agriculture in charge of meat inspection? Because after bovine growth hormone, Monsanto's got great things great things anticipated for what they refer to as the biological factory. They view cows as a biological factory in which genes can be spliced in or spliced out, hormones added or subtracted, and then the products of that biological activity come out, like the milk. When asked why he was moving from the Food and Drug Administration to the Department of Agriculture, he said it was very simple. Cattle could no longer be considered animals. They had to be considered experimental objects. You get the logic, right? Oh, good, I'm glad. They asked Mike to explain it, and he said, end of the conference.
What do they consider us?
I believe that we were considered anomalies. Now, anomaly is not so bad. You can be tolerant of an anomaly, you just don't have to take it seriously. But they now consider us to be competitors. Do you know why we're competitors? Because patients who come to you probably recruit for you to your practice, and your book is probably getting fuller. And if it's not, talk to the person next to you, because their book is getting fuller. They'll give you some hints. And today, we're in a negative-sum game. You know what a negative-sum game means? All the doctors are no longer protecting each other's flanks. I'm an AMA physician. I belong to the National Association of Physician Broadcasters. I helped found that organization. And I received a speech, which I was encouraged to give. In case I couldn't make up my own mind about healthcare reform, the AMA would give me the speech that they recommended that I, as a physician broadcaster, give. And it was 37 justifications for an expensive lifestyle. And I wondered who wrote this speech. So I called up the communications department of the AMA and I said, who wrote this speech? And they said, oh, we had nothing to do with it. We disavowed that speech. Who wrote that speech, I asked. So I called Jim Todd, who fairly senior at the AMA. He said, well, you know, there are 37 counselors, and each one wrote one sentence, which was incorporated in the speech and could not be changed, because anything that an AMA counselor would write must be perfect. That's what they said to him. Now, we can, in this country, substantially reduce our expenditures for disease care. We can somewhat increment our expenditures for health care and save substantial sums of money while making people healthier. If we look at what that means in more quantitative terms, by the year, this is original analysis that we've put together, and it'll be out in a book in about 6 months. This looks at healthcare expenditures in billions of dollars. Now notice that 5,000 billion is 5 trillion, and 40,000 billion is 40 trillion. And in the year 2020, unless we make a big change, this red line is going to happen, and $40 trillion will be the size of our disease care budget in the United States. And guess what the gross national product will be that year, in the year 2020, if we don't make a sea change? Pretty close. It'll be about $50 trillion. Uwe Reinhardt, the Princeton economist, was asked what the future of America would be like without substantial change in the practice of medicine. I'm not talking about the financing now. And he said, imagine simply hospital beds from sea to shining sea with patients taking care of each other because everyone is sick. Now, When you're stuck with the consequences, with the symptom suppressive therapies, with the therapies that really don't have a molecular basis, when you're left only with the ability to say, no, doctor, your contribution is not worthy to this journal. We don't have space. It's only a breakthrough. We don't have space for breakthroughs in our journal. Right? When you have hardening of the categories, it's really very hard to see the opportunity. And some state medical boards misunderstand physicians like ourselves as purveyors of less than factual, scientific, legitimate, advanced, comprehensive, competent, caring healthcare. And you dentists have been way ahead of us physicians for a long time. So I'm not surprised that the dentists are more able to embrace biological medicine ahead of the pathologically driven and somewhat pathological medical system. I have concluded, by the way, that while illness is clearly a problem, diagnoses are much more malignant. Diagnoses are much more pathological than disease. Very often, the most important thing that I do for a person is explain to them that their condition is atypical and idiopathic, which is right in their chart. They don't even fit the classic definition of whatever it is. And all of a sudden, a whole form of thought is removed from their thinking about themselves. Do you know if you have an image of what it's like to have a particular condition and you get that diagnosis, you are likely to fulfill that image? Do you know if your doctor can unlatch you from the diagnosis, your doctor can do you a lot of good? Very often I say to people, well, I can understand why that doctor thought you had idiopathic, hyper atypical Tsutsugamushi fever. I can understand that. But I'm not sure you fit the characteristics of that, and maybe we'll suspend making a diagnosis for a while, and let's see if we can't just get you well. The patient looks back at me and says, well? You mean getting well is a possibility? I said, well, let's not exclude the possibility. Most doctors convey the sense that the chronic disease can be reduced in the intensity of its suffering. Some of us are interested in getting down to basics. If you've got a nutritional deprivation, correct it and don't aim too low. Do you know how much vitamin E that means for a menopausal woman? 3,000 IU a day. Minimum of 1,500. You can go to 5,000 to 6,000 safely. What form of vitamin E? Alpha, beta, gamma, delta. Mixed natural tocopherols. Mixed natural tocopherols with selenium in the selenomethionine form. 1 milligram a day. Do you know why we need 1 milligram a day? Because we live in the 20th century. Do you know that if you breathe the air in this country, it will use up somewhere between 0.2 and 0.5 milligrams a day of selenium? If you're not taking in more than that, you're in deficit with regard to selenium. Selenium activates vitamin E. Selenium and vitamin E complex are essential for picking up the electrons in the membrane that come out of these immune recognition reactions, another link to the immune system, picking up the electrons in the membrane and shuttling them through the cytoplasm to the mitochondria to make energy. But what if when you get the electron down to the mitochondrion, there's a mercury molecule saying, spit out, spit out, spit out the electron? That's what happens as a free radical in the mitochondria. So now you need an antioxidant, not just for your membrane, but for your mitochondria. What's the antioxidant du jour for the mitochondria? CoQ10. How much CoQ10? Between 100 and 360 milligrams a day. If you're Folkers, you prefer closer to 360 milligrams a day. I think it makes sense to take 120 milligrams 3 times a day if you have a high insulin value 2 hours after eating and therefore are at cardiovascular risk. I think it makes sense to take 120 milligrams 3 times a day of coenzyme Q10 if you have chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia. If you have toxins in your body or immunotoxins in your body, coenzyme Q10 will protect your mitochondria. The only thing that protects your mitochondria better than coenzyme Q10 is? No, not glutathione. Glutathione's big brother, ascorbate. Remember that ascorbate picks the electron up from the E-selenium complex and delivers it to the glutathione. What is the most effective way in the human body of raising the glutathione level in the human cell? Raise the ascorbate level. And this had been challenged, but it's now been re-pinned down again and again. The most effective way to raise the glutathione level in the gut, in the lungs, in the muscles, in the brain, in the liver, is to raise the ascorbate level. In a state of health, you're taking some ascorbate. I'm glad to see the perk buffered ascorbate being poured into the jar. A demonstration, veritably as we speak. Watch this man's hair grow on the top of his head. No. See, he's been listening. Which article? Oh, how much ascorbate? Ah, ascorbate, the mystery molecule. There's no number. But you can find out, or your patients can find out by doing an ascorbate flush. Buffered ascorbate always, because these patients need the calcium, magnesium, potassium, and zinc. Buffered ascorbate. And you do a flush. How much ascorbate does it take to do a flush? In healthy people, not much. For me, when I'm home, 4 grams of ascorbate, I get a flush. When I travel, 15 grams of ascorbate, I get a flush. When I go to the FDA meetings, 50 grams of ascorbate, I get a flush. Even I have stressors. I want you to know I sat at a meeting in which an FDA fellow acknowledged that I was a consultant to the FDA, that I had been a senior scientist at NIH, that I was widely and world-renowned in some of my publications. However, I could not be considered an expert in the area of human nutrition because I had not studied nutrition in medical school. And I admitted that I was defrocked and self-taught, which incensed him further, because if I was self-taught, how could I possibly be certified? And I explained that I was a fellow of the American College of Nutrition, and he said, who are they? And I said, a bunch of MDs who get board certification in nutrition after 1,500 hours of certified training. He said, but what do you know? I said, well, I'm also a fellow. And I went on and on and on, and I do editorials for, and I'm on the board of the Journal of Nutritional Medicine. He said, where are they out of? I said, London. He says, you see? Cleared that one up right away, didn't we? But you see, this has been going on a long time. And it's getting more acute because of the economics. And we are coming to a time when managed care alliances will find every one of you in this room their best friend, because you can deliver outcome results at low cost and low risk in a reasonable period of time, not magic bullets, but miraculous little BBs. Maybe not patentable biotechnology that's going to make $100 million for chess industries or whatever. But do you know that if this country spent $60 billion to correct the nutritional deprivations that we know exist from the peer-reviewed literature, heaven forfend, we would save a minimum of $280 billion a year for a net saving of $220 billion a year in just 7 categories of disease. Just 7 major categories of disease could save the country $220 billion. As Everett McKinley Dirksen said in the United States Senate, a billion here, a billion there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. Well, even with current inflation, 100 billion here, 100 billion there, we're talking about real money, folks. I did a briefing, and I was asked if this were true, why NIH was not leading the charge in this direction. And I said, very good question, don't have the full answer, but I can suggest 3 things, the first of which is it wasn't invented here, which is the name of the institution. The second is hardening of the categories. And the third is, when you're trained to hear the hoofbeats of disease in the darkness of the night, it is hard to appreciate the bright light of health and the underlying metabolic causes thereof. Our previous speaker pointed out that it's in the biochemistry books. It is. And it's in the metabolism books. And most of us studied this material, and then we took the first part of our boards and we had a prefrontal lobotomy. We go to the wards, and nobody talks biochemistry or metabolism, and you very slowly lose the information, because if you don't work with information all the time, how are you going to remember it? Doctors call me up and they say, well, how should I build glutathione in the body? And I say to them, glutamine, glycine, and cysteine 2 grams of glutamine BID, a gram of cysteine, EINE, BID, 2 grams of glycine, BID, and you see the glutathione peroxidase and the glutathione synthetase does this and that on the influence of free radical reaction. And they say, wait a minute. I said, well, don't you remember this? And they say, no, I don't remember this. If you would just do it at 33 RPM instead of 78, I'd like to listen to it. But you see, I've been a biochemist. I'm coming out of the closet now, but I've been a biochemist all along. And the great good fortune that I had by taking a leave of absence after the second year of medical school, going into biochemistry, and then coming back to finish up the clinical years, the great good fortune was I could ask questions about untreatable patients that had to do with things like metabolism, biochemistry, amino acids, carbohydrates, fats, and every once in a while, we would find that the carnitine deficiency was really related to the fatty acid energy metabolism, and the patient got well. I was in the airport in Mexico City lamenting my fate when I thought I had lost my wallet. And what was on the shelf? L-carnitine in the airport. I said, who buys this? She said, Mexicans who travel through. Not Americans. Americans don't come to Mexico City to buy L-carnitine yet, although that may be in the offing. Part of NAFTA, you see, is to take a few $1 billion a year and transfer it to the Mexican economy so that Mexicans can bring dietary supplements across the border and send them through a smuggling operation to Americans. And if you think that the new law protects you, wait till you hear the interpretation. Do you know that the Food and Drug Administration said even though the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the way the Congress interprets the new law, because they're at war with the old law, they'll be at war with the new law. The old law is the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act, and the new law is the Dietary Supplements, Access to Dietary Supplements Act. But on the third day after President Clinton signed the bill, his own commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration and his deputy commissioner said, yes, you can assume we're at war with this bill and anyone who takes this bill seriously. I think that what they want is for us to get angry, whoever they are. I think they want us to see them as separate from us. I think they want us to get rip-roaring pissed. And I don't think we should. I actually recommend that you walk your talk, that you recommend it to your patients and let them go by results, that you actually contribute to what you believe in. If there are organizations that give you information, contribute to those organizations. If there are consumer organizations like Citizen Action that want to preserve patient privilege and doctor rights, I think we as physicians should join with the consumers, and the consumers should join with those physicians who want to keep the relationship between family practice physicians or primary care physicians or primary dentists and their patients one that has some meaning and some sanctity to it. When asked whether owning the doctor's practice would influence the standards of care, the chief executive officer of the second largest medical alliance in the country said, why would you think that our owning the doctor would influence the doctor's standard of care? And refused to answer the question. Now, the American Academy of Family Practice hopes to sign up half the family practice doctors in this country into an alliance that will negotiate based on standards of practice. You mean that the patient has a right to have a certain quality of care? If you accept a certain analogy, the approach to managed competition is kind of like deregulation in the airlines. Have you seen what good has come out of deregulation in the airlines? They asked C. Everett Koop, who was our previous Surgeon General, to describe what it would be like if we had national health care under the existing concept of disease care. And he said, well, I think it would probably have all the humanity of the IRS, all the efficiency of the Postal Service, and all the economy of scale of the Department of Defense. I was on a choo-choo train with him not too long after, and I asked him whether he still felt that way, and he really does. I asked him about antioxidants, and he said, you know, there's a big opportunity in this country for people to correct chronic illnesses and reduce their cardiovascular, diabetic, and other autoimmune disease risk by taking antioxidants. I said, there is? I said, how did you know that, Ev? He said, well, I was offered $7 million to endorse antioxidants. I said, did you do it? He said, no, I never take money for endorsements, but they did make me smart. They did briefings for him, whoever that they were here, and they convinced the ex-Surgeon General of the United States that antioxidants are a major opportunity. And so he is willing to say what is the way it is. Now that makes him a refreshing change in Washington, and they consider him an anomaly. You talk to people in Washington about C. Everett Koop, and they say, well, he's an anomaly. You see, he tells it the way it is. Oh. You see, in Washington, they expect a veil to come down upon you when you go inside the Beltway. And I asked, when I got to Washington, what book would help guide me to understand Washington, D.C. and its workings, and they gave me a copy of Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. It's a good primer. Now, why do we do it, and why should we consider doing it joyfully? Well, for me, it's Anna, the 9-year-old on the left, and Sky, the 5-year-old on the right. He's the executive baby with the calculator in his mouth. But an article by Zoltan Rona, primary care physician in Toronto, who writes a syndicated column and appears on national television in Canada. And he's writing an article about the public being deceived by the vitamin E and beta-carotene study. Do you remember that New England Journal study? That study, aside from a very important point that Zoli, I think, first brought to our attention, the supplements used in that Finnish study were coated with a substance known to cause cancer. So the increased cancer that was observed may have been induced by the yellow dye, which is not legal in the United States, but is not illegal in Finland. But what the study really says is, if you're a 30-pack-year smoker, throwing a little beta-carotene and vitamin E at you won't solve the problem. But the way it came out on the national media was, take none a day. We had Victor Herbert interviewed by Connie Chung on national television as an impartial expert in nutrition and a consultant to major government agencies. And then she turned and said, we will now discuss with Dr. Bruce Blumberg, a paid hack for the for the dietary supplement industry. Dr. Blumberg, what do you have to say? What? Bruce Blumberg heads the Tufts Nutrition Institute. He is a world-class scientist. He is in nobody's pocket. He may once have attended a meeting of the CRN, the Council for Responsible Nutrition, or something like that. But there are people who, knowing that the facts do not support their point of view, will not let the facts stand in the way. And I believe that more than anything else, they would like an adversarial relationship to develop. And in some cases, it has. I was, for example, accused once of claiming to cure AIDS with Christmas tree lights. Don't I look like the kind of a guy who would go around claiming to cure anything? I mean, I've never made a claim to cure nothing. I don't cure anything, right? But people who wanted me held in a bad light felt it okay to say that I claim to cure AIDS with Christmas tree lights. Well, you see, really what we're talking about goes back a very long time, but is new yet again because of the opportunity provided by these functional tests to look comprehensively in a new way at patient response to a wide variety of common hypersensitizing or immunotoxic reactants. The debate really goes back to the time when Louis Pasteur triumphantly held up a flask and said, "Gentlemen, in this flask I have the cause of cholera." Now, he didn't really talk that way, but his arch scientific rival, Antoine Béchamp, leapt to his feet and said, "No, monsieur, in your flask you have merely a microbe. The cause of cholera is in the host hospitality, is in the internal milieu, is in the internal competency of digestion, secretory IgA, mucin, and other things." He didn't say that, but it's what he meant. And Pasteur shot back and said, "Well, if that is so, monsieur, then drink the flask." And Béchamp said to his assistant, "Drink the flask." And those were the days when assistants did what they were told. And he drank the flask and he did not get cholera. He clearly had the largest inoculum of Vibrio cholera organisms ever given to a human being, and he didn't get cholera. Now, maybe he was afraid of Béchamp. It's not a controlled experiment. But it's a very interesting experiment. Do you know in the 1920s, the man who replaced Pavlov at the Pavlov's Institute in Russia, a very famous scientist, learned that you could condition the immune system of an animal, either favorably or unfavorably, by either being nice to the critter or being adverse to the critter. What a surprise, but do you know how many people live their lives in adversity? When I ask people how much laughter they do during a day, sometimes I see the look in their eye which is roughly, laughter? I'd be happy with neutral. I can't imagine getting up above neutral. What are you talking about, doctor? You have those patients? They kind of shout at you because they haven't been able to express themselves in at least the last 3 or 4 hours. Or the patient who sits there and says, I know. You know what I know means? I know means it's hopeless, it's helpless, oy vey, the other ones, I know they can do it, but not me. You ever have any of those patients? Well, we deserve to take those patients by the hand and do little things with them. I've suggested to people, for example, could you imagine for 2 weeks having a diet that was very high in sugar? It's the diet they're on. Okay, so that's an easy one. Then for 2 weeks, could you imagine having a diet which is very low in sugar? And 80% of what they've been eating all of a sudden goes away for 2 weeks. And they feel different. And their relationships look different, and their ability to learn is different. There are very few parents of hyperactive children who doubt the specific relationship between the provocation or the immunotoxin and the behavior of the child. Whether it be MSG or sulfite or aspartame or certain sugars or other substances, if that's your kid, parents usually have no doubt when it's going on. But the first 5 well-done studies showed no relationship between sugar consumption, additives consumption. The challenge to the Feingold diet hypothesis was really brought on. Do you know who funded those 5 studies? Or the aspartame company, one or the other. What a surprise. In one case, it was funded by the Alcohol Institute. It was a quid pro quo. Aspartame funded a study that the alcohol people wanted. The alcohol people funded a study the aspartame people wanted. All negative studies. What a surprise. Then there was a very honest scientist who had a child. Keith Connor is his name, and his child was hypersensitive to sugar, but the sugar hypersensitivity occurred when the child was home, not when the child was being observed in the laboratory. So the point at which you make your measurement becomes very important. In the previous presentation, the point was made that at different dilutions, and in our case at different times of incubation, you can see different responses to these immunizing substances. And you may need all that functional information integrated for you, distilled down to a plan and an interpretation. And since we've been at this a decade and now have 25,000 cases in our smart system, we can provide you, if you wish, not just a record that recommends what to substitute, in other words, dietary items that are not immunoprovocative or immunotoxic, what specific supplements to correct deficiencies and enhance detoxification, and you will notice that we will not aim too low. Now, we may recommend a dozen supplements because the patient may have multiple deficiencies. And if you want to start with the first 4 or 5 and then add the others only on indication, that's fine. If you want to be complete, that's fine. Vary to the patient. There are some patients who really want to do it in a coherent, comprehensive way, and we try to provide that because we go beyond the nutritional material into healthy habits and might recommend anything from traditional acupuncture to biofeedback. We might recommend massage or active meditation, but we'll get very specific about what book from what source, so we'll make it easy for you or for your nutrition educator to work with the patient in a comprehensive way. And I come back again to the fact that the control system of the human body, is made up of the neurochemical, endocrine hormonal, and immune defense and repair systems. So all 3 of those are part of one master control system. If the immune defense and repair system is out of whack, you can just about bet dollars to donuts that either the neurochemical or the hormonal endocrine system or both will be out of whack.
And depending on whether you have only 2 or 1 or 3 out of balance, that determines which exact type of autoimmunity you get. And we've related this in studies to antioxidant status. You can do that with measurements, for example, from Pantox laboratories in San Diego or from SpectraCell laboratories in Houston, an antioxidant profile. I happen to like the one that Charlie Thomas gives you because that will give you beta-carotene and vitamin A, ascorbate, glutathione, both reduced and oxidized, oxidized LDL and unoxidized, oxidized cholesterol and unoxidized, coenzyme Q10 and riboflavin, all on one sample. But that sample has to be obtained in a very specific way, quickly processed, put on dry ice immediately, and sent to Charlie Thomas in a hermetically sealed mayonnaise jar. Because doing antioxidant measurements like glutathione is very difficult. It's easy to get bad numbers, it's hard to get good numbers. It's worth getting good numbers, and if you want to know what predicts pneumocystis in the lungs, do you know what it is? Having a glutathione less than 50% of expected. Ron Crystal showed that, Alton Meister and Tony Fauci showed that again. How do you raise the glutathione in the lungs? Ain't with Bactrim, what? Ascorbate. And as much ascorbate as you need to hit the therapeutic targets. Yes, Tim?
Are you differentiating ascorbate and ascorbic acid?
Yes. I'm always saying ascorbate because I always mean buffered and I never mean ascorbic acid. I always mean the fully buffered potassium, calcium, magnesium, zinc is my preferred form. Tasty effervescent drinks, such a deal. Recrystallized even better. Potato source even better. Not corn source preferred. And orally, usually you can do the job. Sometimes you need intravenous pulse in the office, and sometimes you need continuous infusion at home. How do you distinguish the patient who needs one from the other? By the degree of damage to their gut. If you've got enteropathy, atrophy of the intestine, absorption uptake block, you put vitamin C in, it doesn't get absorbed. That's the patient who needs intravenous vitamin C. If they have a little bit of atrophy, reversible on these pulse infusions in the office once a week for, say, 3 or 4 weeks, that's enough. But they may need infusions at home, and home care companies are very receptive to modified hyperalimentation. Modified hyperalimentation in which you follow the formula of Blackburn and Jaffe, who pointed out 4 years ago that a high blood sugar or insulin was bad for you. And the net out of that is hyperalimentation causes hyperinsulinism in almost everybody. So you start on standard hyperal and replace gram for gram one hexose with another. Glucose for ascorbate. Couldn't be more logical, could it? It's still modified TPN, reimbursable. Don't mention the A word. Okay? This is modified 3-in-1 hyperalimentation. Now, if you want to put in a little extra hydroxycobalamin, terrific. If you want to put in extra B complex or magnesium or pantethine, terrific. Or biotin or multi-trace minerals 9, terrific. Or all of the above, or get the protocol from us, which is in King's Guide, I believe now, and you can use it as a standard infusion protocol. We've got a recommended for catabolic illness and cancer, recommended for AIDS and the type 3 reactions, recommended for type 2 reactions, autoimmune reactions, and recommended for type 1 autoimmune reactions. Which infusion formula might optimize? When do you need glutamine and cysteine in your infusion formula? When do you not? When do you need 300 grams of ascorbate a day? That's 300,000 milligrams. I had a surgical colleague call me up not too long ago and say, "Doctor, we know about your work, and you wouldn't recommend a lethal dose of ascorbate." I said, "No, I wouldn't recommend a lethal dose of ascorbate. That would be bad for the patient's health." The doctor said, "Oh, I'm so glad we agree. So you did mean 25 milligrams, not 25 grams. I said, "No, I meant 25 grams, not 25 milligrams. He said, "Well, but that's lethal." I said, "Gee, could you enlighten me?" "Well, we all know it's lethal." I said, "Well, could you cite one source, literature or committee or book?" He said, "Well, the pharmacist knows it's legal," so I called the pharmacist who told me that it was lethal. Lethal. And I asked the pharmacist for a citation. The pharmacist said, well, it's funny. I looked in Facts and Comparisons, it's not there. I looked in King's Guide, it's not there. I looked in the Lawrence Review of Pharmacognosy, it's not there. I looked in Harrison's Textbook of Medicine, it's not there. All of these books have forgotten that ascorbate is lethal. Isn't that amazing? I knew that hardening of the categories was such that we weren't likely to make much progress in that specific case. But when the patient got home, we could start the ascorbate. Another anecdote very close to me personally. My PhD thesis advisor, Carl Franzblau, got hepatitis from a transfusion. What's a scientist to do? And his hepatitis became fulminant, and he was told he was going to die because he was a steroid failure, and his SGOT and SGPT were climbing, and his liver was failing. And I said, but Carl, you know, there is this literature about ascorbate infusions being really good for hepatitis. Well, he could at least still read. I sent him the literature. Alan Magaziner has published. There's some older literature in the Ohio Medical Journal, Southern Medical Journal. Carl said, let's try this. Nobody at the great University Hospital in Boston would do it because they were afraid ascorbate might be lethal. They've already written this guy off. He's going to die from fulminant hepatitis. What's wrong with ascorbate? Well, it might be lethal. Aha! So, Carl went home. Took the ascorbate infusions, and 7 days later, his SGOP, which had been north of 3,000, was now south of 30. And he was beginning to feel much better. And the jaundice cleared, and he went back, and he said, guys, I guess the ascorbate didn't do any harm. And they said, that's the damnedest coincidence. I'm not here to convince you. I am here to say, give it a try. I am here to say the new functional tests give you tools that your other colleagues would like to have if only they knew how powerful they were, how predictive they were, how helpful they were. Think comprehensively. Think about these approaches so that you can approach nutritional, attitudinal, and environmental competency. When you do a complete workup and the patient still has problems, think about the basidiomycete molds that are nite sporulators and might be in their ductwork. Think about the mite hypersensitivity, which is even allergists know about that. Think about the fact that for an individual, something which might generally be good, for them would be bad. So the individual who's eating a healthier diet but has an immunotoxic hypersensitivity reaction to garlic, brown rice, and carrots should not be a macrobiotic person. And I think this is particularly poignant because Aveline Kouchy, Michio Kouchy's wife, has cancer and is not doing particularly well, and they won't accept the new tests. A blood test of her immune system looking for food hypersensitivities to things she might be eating, like umeboshi plums. We test for umeboshi plums in our therapeutic foods immunotoxicity lymphocyte response assay, and we had it come up positive. It doesn't come up positive very often, so I called. I thought it was a false positive. I called the doctor. The doctor says, my patient wouldn't eat umeboshi plums. What the hell are umeboshi plums? They're salt plums. On the phone, there was this long pause. The patient said, how did you know? We didn't know. We won't tell. What are you talking about? I'm macrobiotic. Like it's something not quite nice to say in a full tone of voice that you're macrobiotic. You won't tell my doctor, will you? I said, no, ma'am, this is just between us. But umeboshi plums were not good for that person. People who wear contact lenses and have mercury hypersensitivity should not take contact lenses that have thiomerisol or any of those other inert substances in there. The exciting part from my point of view is that when you have a diagnostic tool of sufficient depth and breadth, you can map a new territory, you can look at the causes, get at the underlying mechanisms, detoxify the person, correct their deficiencies, press the reset button on their immune defense and repair system, press the reset button on their neurochemical, attitudinal system, press the reset button on their hormonal and endocrine system, one of those systems. And now you will have a patient who is back in a high level of good health. And do you know that this is exactly what the World Health Organization defines health as? We may not do it in America, but the World Health Organization says that every individual on this planet has the right to the highest attainable individual health and well-being. Now, it acknowledges that not everybody has attainable heights of everybody else. I am not likely to compete successfully with Will Chamberlain or Magic Johnson. But I met Magic Johnson outside a restaurant in Los Angeles. Asked him how he was doing. He said, "The doctors are killing me." I said, "That might be a hint." An hour later, he came over to my table and he said, "What do you do?" I said, "I'm a doctor." He said, "At UCLA?" I said, "No, I was recruited there. I was going to have an appointment in biochemistry, medicine, and pathology and so forth, but I got too interested in the mechanisms of health. And there wasn't any place at that time to pursue research and practice approaches to the mechanisms of health within a great institution like UCLA." He said, "But what am I to do? My manager tells me I have to follow their advice." I said, "Is your manager living your life?" There's not a clear answer to that question, right? Not an obvious answer to that question. I've had people, chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia are very common in Hollywood. I don't know why it is, but it's very common in Hollywood. It may be they have enough disposable income to have such diseases, but it's very common. And a couple, husband and wife, both in the entertainment field, were very grateful because they had done so well. He for fibromyalgia and allergies, she for osteoporosis, menopausal problems, hormonal problems, and fibromyalgia. They wanted to get me together with a friend of theirs who produces a television show called NYPD Blue. And I said, if you would change the name to NYPD Green, I might think about it. And they said, "What?" I said, "Blue is too soothing and sedating. This man has got to be a lunatic." And they said, "How did you know that?" I said, "First of all, anybody who produces a show that successful has got to be a little bit up there. But more importantly, they may not right now be willing to do for themselves what's necessary for them to get well. And that's all I'm interested in." There are many people for whom being suffering less is their goal. And it may be too big a step to think about all of these comprehensive approaches. Start where people are, take one step at a time. Be an example of someone who walks the walk as well as talks the talk. And know that each day you can be a little healthier than you were the day before. And so by the end of 120 years, you can be at the beginning of a good, healthy, long life. Thank you.
Thank you, Russell. Is it on? Is this on? We're going to entertain some questions and answers here for the next 10 minutes or so. You can ask any question you want of anybody, or you can just ask the room with all this brain power
Right.
for any question you might
Right.
have.
Right. Anybody who's got an answer, shout it out.
That's right. So what we want to do,
Can you describe a little bit our lymphocyte sensitizing test on metals?
Yes, the lymphocyte response assay with regard to metals is done in the following way. It is very similar to Vera's. In fact, let me use one of her slides and I'll illustrate the similarities and the differences. Aha! Scientists know where those slides are. It's like the old McNamara trick. Sensitized cells from the body, when exposed to an antigen for a long enough time, become large lymphocytes, go into blast, proliferative response, and after 4 or 5 days, it's time to pulse them with thymidine. What we do is a little different, but similar in the beginning. Only sensitized human lymphocytes will respond. We have a unique microtiter system in which we coat the antigens that we have purified onto plates that we have made. The reason we do that is the antigens that are commercially available for the minerals are not very pure. And even if you use ACS reagent grade, there may be contaminants in them. So we purify all of our own antigens, coat them in a distinctive way in a volatile buffer, adhere them to the microtiter plate, such that we have approximately 1 picomole of metal in a monolayer on the microtiter plate. We then add 35 microliters of cell-rich plasma as a modification of the Born and Cross technique that Jaffe and Dakin described in the Journal of Clinical Investigation in 1974. But we use that Born and Cross technique for a 2-syringe draw to get the whole blood. We spin gently to get cell-rich plasma. We never make a buffy coat, and we never isolate the lymphocytes. This is a little different, because you isolate lymphocytes, of course, to do a cell culture and proliferative response, which is the correct way to do it. Our assay has the advantage of being autologous. That is, the patient's plasma is a suspension medium for the patient's lymphocytes, and the patient's own macrophages and basophils and granulocytes are present. So when the cytokine signals go out, after antigen sensitized cell recognition, a lot of communication goes on, and we take advantage of that because that turns on our endpoint enzyme, which is a kinase. It happens, coincidentally, to be the kinase that is in the middle of the MHC superantigen site, which means it's the kinase involved with antigen recognition. We've only recently really proven that. So we've been able to do this assay for many years. We're only working up the mechanism of its action now, and it's confirming itself not just in reproducibility of less than 3% variance day to day, which for a cell culture assay is very good, but an assay that we can do on 35,000 cells. So on 1 ounce of blood, we can do 300 lymphocyte response assays, including to 20 different minerals. And we do not have a test that differentiates, say, the 6 different mercury types. But coincidentally, 4 of the 6 epitopes are in our antigen, because we didn't know which antigen to pick. And I figured, as an immunologist, methylmercury couldn't be the only game in town. So we picked a thiomerisol adduct, because that was a big preservative. That's around a lot. We picked another thiol adduct in the same class. We picked methylmercury, and we picked phenylmercury. So we have those 4 in our mercury assay. Now, we cannot distinguish for you which of those 4 caused the hypersensitivity. But we can tell you whether they had hypersensitivity or not. We have not had the pleasure yet of collaborating to see how the MELISA assay compares with the ELISA ACT, and in turn both compare with properly done skin testing. Badly done skin testing can disprove anything, or generate random numbers, whichever you prefer. But properly done skin testing, in our experience, in skeptical hands, has predicted what we have found with the assay, but it takes 72 hours to do properly done skin testing.
Not only that,
And maybe more, because
boosting the patient.
Because, that's right, you're boosting the patients, and you have Arthus reactions or Schwartzman reactions or serum sickness reactions that can happen 14 days after exposure. So skin testing is very flawed. But it gives a problem for those of us in the lymphocyte response business, because people say, what is your gold standard reference assay?
It's not
Well,
existent, actually.
we're defining the new standard. Okay? What was the standard before there were standards? That's the question we have to ask. The whole, it's whatever you say it is, and that's why to come up with data, and I have not heard most of the data that you presented today, but our data in fibromyalgia, in chronic fatigue, in multiple sclerosis is very similar to yours in how common hypersensitivity to mercury and other minerals is, also how common adjuvant hypersensitivity is from silicone or other similar upregulators of the immune system. And when you put it all together, I think there's great opportunity to use these kinds of high precision assays. I was at an EPA-sponsored meeting last week on mercury neuroimmunotoxicity that Joan Cranmer and Bob Sonawani and Barry Johnson and others spoke at. Lorscheider presented his data, and I asked these classical kill 'em and count 'em toxicologists about Lorscheider's data, and you know what they said? We should begin to look at that. Hey, now that's really rocking into the 20th century.
After 150 years, finally.
Well,
Hey.
well, I actually wrote to Lorscheider. I want to comment that because 2 years ago when we got our first cases recovering from multiple sclerosis and having this high prevalence of responses to mercury, I wrote Lorscheider And I said, hey, shouldn't we look on your things with toxicity and see if we have immunologic reactions? And he didn't answer the letter.
Oh, really?
I just think they are toxicologists, that's it.
Well, no, they
And
are.
on the last meeting in status quo's amalgam question in spring in Germany, Marie Wilmy was there, and I will say, hey, it's all very interesting that you have all this mercury deposited in the organs. You can't never ever win the battle without
Right.
showing the allergic reaction in the same individuals. Shouldn't they do that? And he said, well, why don't you send me your papers? I did. I didn't get any response at all.
How long takes your procedure?
Yes, our procedure is a very brief culture because when you look at this enzyme, after 3 hours of incubation, you're at the end point of the assay. So the blood is drawn on Monday. On Tuesday, it will be in our lab, whether it's from Europe or from wherever. Tuesday afternoon, we have 300 cell cultures. We have 72 hours in which to do the assay, if you follow our procedure, which means the next day, if we need to repeat something, we repeat it. Then we put it through the computer smart system, and by the 4th day, the interpretive results are ready to go back to you, including what to do about the information that we've obtained.
Thank you. More questions?
I'd like to make a statement.
Steve, could you ask?
This is kind of a dream of mine to get Russell and Vera and Jess in the same room together, with Dr. Landerman being the conscience back here.
Yeah, Jess, you want to come up?
I have a problem with gold, and it's not because I like to use it to sell it, but I'm curious about the difference between the numbers that we get from Jess's lab and the numbers I'm hearing, especially from Vera, where 30–40% of the test subjects are showing allergies to gold, or showing an immune response to gold, whereas Jess's numbers run about 3%
Right.
using.
Well, remember, Jess is doing an IgG assay. Is that correct, Jess? Right. There you go, Jess. An IgG assay. And Jess is reporting the accurate information that he obtains, and he does his quality control, and if the assay run is out of range, I'm sure he rejects it and repeats it, and he does his things according to quality control. But that's an IgG ELISA. If you want IgG ELISA information, Jess is the guy to get it from, and Jess has got IgG ELISAs for things that we don't have a lymphocyte response assay for, so there's no competition between the assays. We favor, Vera and I favor, lymphocyte response assays, partly because we're immunologists, but partly because it gives you information about IgA, IgM, IgG, maybe immune complexes, and very likely cell-mediated immunity, which is very important. What Jess has done is make a breakthrough in IgG testing for, what?
It has no ELISA.
Oh, it's not an ELISA, Jess?
No, it's a precipitation. Simple agglutination.
Okay, is it a red cell agglutination? Sorry.
We have used 4 methods, found similar results with all 4, and we generally would do that on a precipitin basis.
Precipitin, as in red cell precipitin or how?
No, just a straight.
Just an antigen-antibody precipitin. So you're taking a suspension of the dental material,
Exactly.
exposing it to a standard amount of patient's serum,
Exactly.
and if the patient has got antibodies that latch onto the antigen of the dental material, then a complex which is insoluble will form and precipitate.
And we will want to be very careful to be sure that we are not getting an agglutination
Right.
versus precipitation.
No, that's right. See, a precipitin reaction is significant, and a agglutination reaction is an artifact. Right. Very important point. I did not realize it wasn't ELISA, and thank you, Dr. Anderson.
Yeah, I believe that she's working very carefully, but
Yes.
up to date, there is no proof that in the precipitate you have immunoglobulins and not other proteins. And that's why I tried to
Well,
ask him and to check it with the...
No, that's a very good question. Jess, have you taken the precipitins and done monoclonal antibody against the precipitin with a fluorescent probe to prove what you think and what I think, which is that there's the patient's antibody interacting with the antigen, which is a theory, but has that not been done yet or has been done?
We have not done that.
Okay. That's worth doing in the science lab.
What we have been careful to do at this point is that we can demonstrate the specificity
Right.
And we can demonstrate between multiple rabbits
Right.
that we are not getting an oddball enzyme coming down.
Right.
That we can do.
Right.
But we have not carried forth to the monoclonal level yet.
For Vera, for ourselves, for Jess, for all of us working in this field, the number of interesting methodologic, basic science, mechanism questions to be asked is far greater than the answers we now have. What we do have, however, is a great opportunity to avoid one thing which I believe is permanent. You know what that is? Extinction. It was pointed out to me not too long ago by a professor at Princeton that extinction is permanent. Now that was a very bright man. No. I believe that if we are prudent, in light of all we do know today, we'd act from an excess of caution. We would take in lots of nutrient-rich antioxidants. We would do as much as we could to identify the individuality of the individual. I think Vince has talked about his data. Dr. Vince Beckhardt has another approach to getting large arrays of data about patients. And all of these approaches, I think, show promise. They are not necessarily measuring the same things, although Vince and I had a case not too long ago where our assessment by lymphocyte response assay and Vince's assessment by his diagnostic probe was that an individual had lymphocytosis and not leukemia, and therefore the bone marrow transplant wouldn't be necessary because lymphocytosis isn't generally treated by a bone marrow transplant.
Yeah, but you can make the difference between leukemia and lymphocytosis if you just prove the redox potential in the cells. If you check up the NAD and ADH ratio with the nitrobloctetrazole test, you get the difference, huge difference.
Right. Professor Ionesco has just pointed out that if you really want to distinguish a lymphocyte being either leukemic or healthy, you can do it on lots of energetic bases because the NAD ratio is off. But so is the ascorbate to dehydroascorbate ratio. So is the reduced to oxidized glutathione ratio. Health can be defined as a state in which the reducing elements of the body are in readiness.
Exactly.
In a healthy person, there are 99 reduced ascorbate molecules for every one dehydro, and there's no diketogulonic acid. So when we asked Mark Levine of NIH, who is studying vitamin C, whether he was able to distinguish ascorbate from dehydro from diketogulonic acid, he said, why would you? You never see diketogulonic acid. I said, Mark, that's in healthy people. He said, well, we can only give vitamin C to healthy people because NIH has not approved research on human subjects consuming vitamin C if they're patients. Only healthy controls can take ascorbate in studies. Thank you very much. But what we want to know are these ratios, the redox potential, the zeta potential of the cell, all of this high-tech stuff. Do you know NASA's been doing this for a while? You can put a clip on your ear and know what the PCO2, PO2, and pH is, at least of the arterialized capillary bed. Non-invasive probe. In some surgical operations, you can put a contact lens in the patient's eye and get the same information because the tears are in such rapid equilibrium with the plasma. The tears are a kind of ultrafiltrate of the plasma. So is the saliva. The functional adrenal stress index test that I mentioned can be done on the plasma because nature has already done the ultrafiltrate. It's cheap to measure free cortisol and free DHEA in the saliva because that's all that is there. And that's the active molecule. And the relationship is 1-to-1 between plasma and saliva. So we have these new functional tests, whether they become precipitin tests like Jeff's, whether they're lymphocyte response assays like Vera or ours, whether they're provocative urine mineral tests, whether they are adrenal stress index tests. This is a whole new world. Now, how many of you is this review and how many of you is this new? How many of you would be interested in a whole seminar that just walked through protocols for treating specific chronic illnesses, looking at how you make the diagnosis with the new functional test, how you interpret that information, and then how you put it into clinical practice? How many people are interested? Okay. I think that this kind of a meeting is a chance where we can get together and start talking intelligently about these things. We can actually say words like biochemistry and not be looked down on. At least not in the whole room. Some of you may look down on us for saying biochemistry. That's okay.
Thank you, Russ. More questions? going to be a little short form. We'll go maybe another 15 minutes, and then we should call it a day.
It's wonderful to hear all this technical information from all these wonderful experts. I want to say something that has nothing to do with the science that we're talking about, but with the practicality of getting what we're trying to do out to the public. Now, this nice doctor from Sweden said that, you know, she tries to convince the doctors with her viewpoint. You try to convince them, and I try, we all try to go to these establishment doctors to convince them of our viewpoint. Now, let's take a look at this. Are they trying to convince you of their viewpoint? No. What they're doing is going out and promoting to the public their viewpoint. They're selling their viewpoint to the public, and the public is buying it because they're putting in money and advertising and promoting to the public their viewpoint. Now, but in addition to your attempts to try to convince your colleagues in the establishment to look at your viewpoint, you can spend as much time, effort, and money into convincing the public about your viewpoint. You see? Because it's the consumer, ultimately, that benefits by either your approach or their approach. Okay? And that, you need to look at that as another avenue of attack to get what you're all about into the minds of the public. So I just wanted to add that to that.
And let me build on what Jack just said. If it hasn't started in your state, it should soon start. If you're not a part of it, you might want to be a part of it, and that is the legislative initiative to reform the regulatory boards and the insurance criteria. The New York State law will now have 25% representation by physicians whose approach is comprehensive or alternative, if you will. I don't know what it's alternative to, or complementary. And it's likely that those physicians in New York will be Woodson Merrill and Doris Rapp, both distinguished physicians. Woody teaches at Columbia, but practices the kind of medicine that you would learn about here because it works and because he didn't have hardening of the categories when he came out of medical school. There are legislative reforms. You'd be surprised how little attention it takes to be recognized by the state legislative folks. Not many folks drop in there in wherever the legislative land is of your particular state or commonwealth. But you'd be surprised how out of touch with reality, or maybe you wouldn't, be how surprised at how out of touch with reality these folks are. And when you say to them things like that you as a professional do not clearly have the right, the constitutional right, to bring scientific information, whether it be science from Science Magazine or the New England Journal of Medicine or the New York Times, that because you're a health professional, you do not have the right to bring that information to the American public, they will look at you and say, what are you talking about? That's unconstitutional. And you would say, yes, and please talk to our brethren at the Food and Drug Administration who keep explaining that we should put a sock in our mouth and chew on it till the year 2022, by which time some consensus will emerge within the Dijkstra Commission or whatever. We no longer need that. We can have reform at the state level. We're going to have gridlock at the national level this year, at least in terms of healthcare reform, which may be for the better. Don't expect healthcare reform to come out of Washington. Not that you may want what comes out of Washington anyway. But think about it at a state and local level, and you may be surprised what you can accomplish today. The governor of Virginia, as Vince and I were just talking about, is very much interested in spending less and having a healthier Commonwealth. What a concept.
Yeah, there's some incredible things going on. The apologists that are represented in the National Council Against Health Fraud has stated that the alternative medical practitioners are fraudulent in their claims and what they talk about, and they call that an unfair market advantage, and they want academic or legislative administrative sanctions.
Right.
I can't believe it.
30 states have got legislation pending, and Victor Herbert and Stephen Barrett have a new book out that supports this legislation, which basically says that every one of us in this room is, by definition, a quack. Do you know why you're a quack? Because Victor said so. And Victor knows. And if Victor had any question about it, he'd ask Steve, and Steve would ask Victor, and Victor would ask Steve, and they would know the answer.
I might ask Bill.
Right? Now, do all of you know the success that Warren Levin just had? The Board of Regents of the great state of New York said that Victor Herbert was not to be believed. Now, we knew that a long time ago, didn't we? But they said it in print, that he had perjured himself, that he had misrepresented factual information, and that the administrative law judge was remiss in not disqualifying him because of his obvious unscientific bias. Now, that's what you can get. Now, it only took Warren bankruptcy to get that, but, you know, some small victory.
Any more questions? Vera.
I just had, I just want to, first of all, congratulate Russell for extremely nice lecture.
Right.
I appreciate it. It's actually the first time we meeting each
Right.
other in public or privately, but I knew about his test, and I had a couple of questions which I could never get any answers. And
Please.
I think it's just start of the friendships
Yeah.
and maybe cooperation. And I just want to take the ones which are actually most crucial for me
Good.
to understand the test. And the thing is that we do have quite problems looking on strictly allergic reactions and dissociate them from immunologic and toxic reactions. And one of the little problems with another test here is that in accepted immunology and allergology, the precipitation or IgG formation, it's not always the same as allergic reaction, as immunopathological reaction, because by definition, IgG is the protective response and IgM-SL. So you need to have also the genetics background, definitely you often have, but the test on itself will not, it can't be taken as an evidence of pathological reaction unless you have also a complex formation in the kidneys and such things. With regard to the test which Russell is doing, MELISA, it's optimized for elimination of so-called polyclonal mitogenic reactions, which very often you do get by, say, optimal stimulation with metals or with using of, say, food extracts which will have mitogenic properties, meaning that you get reactivity polyclonal of anybody's lymphocytes will react. And I just wonder in your test how, I know that you do it with food extract, I know you get it from Bertie Griffith or from that, and these extracts will definitely make some other reactions, not just allergenic. So I just wonder how you deal with that.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point, and there's several points within it. The first is, what is really going on? Is it really something foreign, an antigen, plus an endogenous antibody of either the G, M, A, D, E class? And of course it turns out that there are at least 4 different flavors of G, 3 different flavors of M, 6 different flavors of A, 2 different flavors of D, but we don't know much about D, and several different flavors of E if you really want to get picky about it. And that then leads to DTH, delayed type hypersensitivity, or cell-mediated immunity, or humoral antibody or immune complex reactions, and is completely different from a toxic effect of that antigen, or a toxic effect of that substance on the individual cells in question, leading to a mitochondrial poisoning and a de-energizing state. The reason that we do the assay 2 ways simultaneously, one colorimetrically to look for the kinase, and the second morphometrically to look for toxicity. Because sometimes we see, even though we are using 10 to the minus 12th to 10 to the minus 15th moles of material, a very small amount of material. We're using about 1,000th of the amount of material on a concentration basis that Vera is using, for example. But we have a much higher amplification system. So if we used a higher concentration, our signal would be too high and our noise would be raised. So we use very small amounts of antigen to avoid this problem, which is a real one. But then we observe the cell's behavior on culture. And if the cells go through an autolysis, if the cells go through a free radical burst leading to crystalloid structures and blebs on the membrane and so forth and so on, then we conclude there's a toxic reaction going on. And we will actually report that the patient may have a total toxic load that exceeds a certain total amount, therefore even trivial amounts or trace amounts of the specific substance. I also want to emphasize, though, that we don't get our antigens from Bertie or from anybody. There's no source of antigen that I know of that's pure enough for what we do. And I've even tried to get antigens from the Bureau of Standards. The problem is they can't give me enough. We have provided antigens to the Bureau of Standards because by the time we get done with them, they're very well characterized. And this is a real problem because most of the food antigens, this is not true for the metals, but most of the food antigens that you buy commercially from a good, reliable provider of allergenic extracts, that antigen for the food parsley contains bacteria, spores, fungi, all sorts of things that could give you nonspecific reactions. We actually have to go to the trouble of starting with the whole material as an old-fashioned physicochemical biochemist. We freeze dry the material and then we extract it. We didn't do that because we wanted to. We did that because we couldn't get the purity and the reproducibility that we want without it.
But obviously, if, for example, for milk allergy, you have 10 or 12 different ectones, don't you?
40.
So I mean
40. Yeah.
So are you checking on all?
No. See, let's say we check 12 different cow dairy antigens and sheep dairy and goat dairy, because very often the person is cow dairy hypersensitive, but they can have sheep cheese, like Romano. They can have goat cheese, like feta, boucheron, Montrachet, and so forth. So we actually checked for goat and sheep as well as 12 different milk antigens, but we're actually embedding 40 different epitopes in the 12 different substances we test for, and we don't reveal whether it's the beta-lactoglobulin, or it's the casein, or it's an oxidation product, or it's a haptene impact on the albumin that's trapped in the milk. There are a zillion different possibilities. Clinically, what I think you want to know is, does the person need to avoid cow dairy products or not? And if the answer is not, then they should have the choice of eating the dairy products. If the answer is yes, they should know the risk that they're incurring on themselves. And we try to keep it as simple as possible. So we're testing 300 substances. We know about 3,400 different antigens we are testing in those 300 challenges. And there are probably a bunch of antigens we don't even know about yet. But we try to get it down to questions like, is it a strong or an intermediate reaction? Does the patient need to avoid it or may they eat it? Do they have digestive competency to deal with it, or is it a cause for immunotoxicity? And that's where we try to get it. There's a lot more molecular elegance beyond that, but I believe that should be left to the bench science and not to the clinical science. And the cost of care isn't going to be favorably impacted if I tell you that it's casein or I tell you that it's beta-lactoglobulin, at least at the current state of knowledge. We actually can differentiate. We could actually test for